On this week's Carrier Wrap, we speak with Berge Ayvazian from Wireless 2020 to discuss the FCC's ongoing incentive auction process, the drastic steps the FCC may need to take in order to find some common ground between television broadcasters and bidders, and the impact 5G trials are having on the proceedings. All right, well, thanks for joining us on this week's Carrier Wrap. I'm your host, Dan Meyer, Editor-in-Chief here at RCR Wireless News. And this week, we are joined by Berge Ayvazian, who's the Senior Analyst at Wireless 2020, to dig into the ongoing FCC incentive auction process. So, Berge, thanks for joining us again. We appreciate it.
Dan, we've done this before, and here we are again.
Here we are again. I was going to say, I was looking back. So the last time we talked was before the reverse auction process finished. And at that point, we found out that television broadcasters wanted $86 billion for their spectrum, which I think many of us perhaps choked on or spit out some water that we were drinking at the time. But again, that was the number that came out, and the FCC seemed very proud of that number. I think you were maybe even one of the more aggressive in predicting that this auction could get some money, but obviously not expecting that much money. And so now we are in the forward auction process where we are seeing bidders so far bid up to about $22 billion through the first couple of weeks, which is not a bad amount, but we are still well far away from the 86 to 88 billion total that's going to be needed. So I guess what's your general view of kind of where we are today and kind of what's happened here in the auction process?
Well, I'm glad you asked me a question because I thought maybe I was interviewing you. But now that we're here to ask me a question.
Yeah, it's not your turn.
Last time we were on this program, we were kind of at the tail end of the reverse auction. And what we learned then was that broadcasters, in fact, were prepared to sell the spectrum. Yeah. And they were prepared to sell more than the FCC had anticipated. If you remember back then, we were talking about maybe 80 megahertz being a clearing level, and that if the FCC was going to auction 80 megahertz, how much revenue could be generated. So by the time we had the last program, we learned that the clearing level was going to exceed 80 megahertz. Yeah. And as a result, I raised my expectations for how much revenue could be raised in this auction. And originally, I was in the $30 to $40 billion range, and I raised it to the $40 to $50 billion. And then I said, if in fact we clear as much as 100 megahertz, we could get $60 billion out of this auction, which would make it the largest auction ever. And certainly that would not only help the government, but it would help both the broadcasters who receive the money as well the licensees, the mobile operators who are going to receive the spectrum at the time they get it. Yeah. So in that range, 40 to 60 billion, we were all pretty comfortable. We were thinking about 80 to 100 megahertz of spectrum being transferred, and that we were thinking that we would go through one round on the forward auction, and that from a timing perspective, we would start the repacking early enough to be able to yield this spectrum and to hand it off to the mobile operators in the year 2018 when we planned it to be. And for that, in that period, we were thinking that this spectrum falls kind of on the cusp between 4G and 5G. And that on the one hand, we're seeing a lot of 5G activity in millimeter wave, but at the same time, you can always use beachfront spectrum. And we've already proven that having a layer of coverage is very important to starting a new generation of technology. That unless we completely change the paradigm by which millimeter wave becomes a peer-to-peer method of communicating in very short distances, and we have a whole different way of designing networks so that the nearest fiber or the nearest base station is hundreds of feet away from me as opposed to kilometers away from me, then maybe by then we'll have a new way of approaching this. But 600 megahertz, the coverage characteristics, the in-building penetration characteristics made it ideal as a layer of coverage. Whether it's the last wave of 4G or the first wave of 5G, it's not clear yet. Timing will tell. And we still have some issues related to 5G to resolve, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But going back to the auction, we needed to think about 600 as to how valuable it is to the mobile operators as the last 600 megahertz characteristic spectrum available, low band spectrum available to augment their 4G, then 4G networks, their LTE networks, when today they're preoccupied with capacity, not coverage. Most of them have coverage satisfied. And at the same time, we're not fully clear what 5G is going to look like and how it's going to unfold. So there's a lot of uncertainty about the value of 5G spectrum. So here we are. We enter this auction. And actually, I think the pace and level of activity, the level of engagement of mobile operators in this forward auction has been very good. And from every indication, there are willing buyers actively bidding. The first phase of this is very interactive, very, let's say, optimistic as to being able to sell this spectrum at reasonable prices. But at the same time, it's hard to see how we get from 22 billion at the end of August to 86 or 88 billion, as you mentioned, which would have to cover the administrative costs of the repacking. So you begin to wonder now, how are we going to get from here to there? And I'll tell you, I have not really corrected our forecast, our prediction, which peaks about 60 billion. And I can see how we would get to 60 billion from where we are. And in fact, I think during the course of September, we can see a set of auction stages that lead to 60 billion. And in fact, I think that the value of 100 megahertz of spectrum at 60 billion is pretty close, pretty spot on. There's all this talk about additional spectrum beyond 100, which would have some encumbrances, which would have to be, have some restrictions placed on it, things that would help deal with interference. But really, I'm thinking about 10 blocks of 10 megahertz, 100 megahertz of spectrum across the country where we've got these geographic areas defined. And the value of that peaking about 60 billion, to me, is a pretty successful outcome and pretty successful auction. So from that perspective, I think the FCC can anticipate a good outcome. The problem is that somebody convinced broadcasters that this spectrum is worth 86.4 billion, and the sellers have not set their willingness to pay, willingness to sell at the right threshold. And I think somebody has to reset these expectations. And the question is, what's the procedure by which the FCC does that in the next round that's coming? Now ask me a question.
Well, I guess then how do we do that next step? I mean, what do you see? I think in place there are some steps involved. Do you think that they're reasonable steps to help bridge that gap between the 80 and the 30 or the 60 even that we're looking at?
Yeah, I fully expect to get through 30.
Okay.
We're at 22. I fully expect to reach 40, 50, and maybe if they keep going and there's enough, some markets will create a value that's high enough to tip it up in that direction. But at some point, it's going to plateau. And I think we're going to reach that point sometime close to the end of September. So we're going to see a level where mobile operators have kind of topped out in terms of both their ability to pay, their sense of what the spectrum is worth to them, and how they perceive the gamesmanship because again, this is a competitive process, and they're not just bidding against each other, but they're bidding against what broadcasters were willing to sell it for. And, I haven't fully analyzed what makes up 86.4 billion. In other words, how much of that is New York? How much of that is Los Angeles? How much of that is Chicago, Detroit, whatever, Boston? We know that the bigger markets command higher prices. The ones that have very excessive demand for spectrum needs are going to get more. But how much more? And how have the broadcasters' expectations been aligned with the buyer's willingness to pay? Recognizing that it's not just mobile operators that are bidding, but we do have some speculators in here. We do have some companies who are going to buy spectrum or going to attempt to buy spectrum and then hope that at some later point they can make money by selling it. And there are rules around that as well. Just as on the reverse auction side, there are all kinds of speculators that bought up TV stations at relatively low prices. May not have seemed like low prices at the time because some of these companies, the businesses they were in, were not viable, were not making money, or were not getting a sufficient return on the investment. So companies were able to go in and buy these stations and be able to turn them into spectrum that the FCC could then auction. So we've got speculators on both sides, which means that these middlemen, these brokers who are selling and buying, some of them the same companies, by the way, we do have some kind of action on the part of these brokers that there is gamesmanship involved. There's very much a sense of how we play the auction process to be able to make money. The other guys, the operators, are trying to pay as little as possible and get the most they can, get the most spectrum they need rather than just any spectrum anywhere they could get it. They need to target those areas where congestion is the worst, where they can anticipate the needs. So, again, I think we're going to reach this topping out point. So you asked me a question. What's the FCC going to do at that stage? Well, I think the rules are pretty clear.
Yeah.
It says they go back and conduct a reverse auction, resetting the amount of spectrum that's being sold. What that means is they're assuming that the pricing mechanism, the valuation that occurred in the first round, remains the same. They just sell less. And if that's the case, obviously 86 could come down to 60, but then you'd only sell 80 megahertz. But from the buyer's side, they're bidding 60 and they want 100 megahertz. So to me, that still leaves a gap. It's like, I want to sell my house to you. And you say, well, if you add a garage, or if it has a garage, I'll pay 100 million. And I say, well, sorry, I don't have a garage, or I can't. If you want a garage, it's going to cost you 150 billion.
Yeah.
So it's really a difference in both how much spectrum they're going to sell and how much they're going to get for it. And clearly, the FCC's incented, motivated to make this a success. And we've already seen Chairman Wheeler use the power of the chairmanship. He isn't going to be in that seat for forever, and he's not going to do this for much longer. So in a way, this is his last hurrah.
Yeah.
He's got to make this work. He's got to come out of this with a success. And my sense is he's got to get broadcasters to rethink their valuation. And I believe he has to do a reverse auction which doesn't just reduce the amount of spectrum sold, but reduces the value that the broadcasters place on that spectrum to a level which reflects what the demand side is willing to pay. And that's how these two sides are going to get closer together. If they don't do that, there's going to be a gap and it's going to fail. And it's hard for me to see how just the rules that are in place are going to bridge that gap.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. And it did seem like, too, leading into the auction, there was a bit of a contentious relationship between the FCC and broadcasters. And the FCC was trying to, drum up support for this, getting broadcasters on board. And obviously, broadcasters were definitely on board for a certain price. But now, now it's going to be a matter of then going back to that argument again and saying, okay, we appreciate you coming on board, but what you're asking for is obviously way out of line. We've seen in the first forward auction, this is what we're looking at. I guess, how do we bridge that gap? And that is going to be an interesting test of Chairman Wheeler's negotiating abilities, it would seem.
And that's the key word, negotiating. Auctions are not about negotiating. Auctions are a mathematical process. And yes, there's gamesmanship involved, there's game theory involved. And it's a competitive process. So you're hoping that there are enough competing interests on the part of the buyers that they're prepared to one-up each other. And they'll do it often enough that it'll start raising the price sufficiently to meet the demand. The problem is we have a two-stage auction, and they're sequential rather than simultaneous or synchronized. There's not an iterative process by which the demand and willingness to pay feeds back on the sellers and says, hey, there isn't enough demand for you. You got to lower your price. This goes back to my house analogy. If enough buyers tell me I'm not going to pay that much for my house, I have to lower the price. I have to lower my expectations. And if I don't, there are a lot of other houses out there that could be bought. And, there are other ways to solve this problem. Now, there has been talk that, this obsession with sub-gigahertz, sub-1 gigahertz spectrum is kind of topping out. It's reached its maximum, where, everything below 1 gigahertz had such high value that people were willing to pay more and more and more. And it's, again, beachfront property. Mm-hmm. But we have transitioned from this coverage period to a capacity period. Yep. And in fact, we may be transitioning from a 4G period to a 5G period. Yeah. Now, if you look at the other activities of the FCC to free up spectrum for 5G, do you see anything close to sub 1 gigahertz in their portfolio? Nothing. Everything is above 6 gigahertz. And in fact, it's more likely to be above 10 gigahertz. And it has all other kinds of characteristics to it where there's a lot of spectrum available. There may be other uses and users of that spectrum, which we may have to force people to share. Mm-hmm. And they'll find mechanisms, they're testing mechanisms to share that spectrum with other incumbents. Mm-hmm. But there really isn't a sense in 5G that there is a necessity to have low band coverage type spectrum that penetrates walls and buildings. Mm-hmm. So the value then, you say, well, what is 600 megahertz spectrum for? What do I need it for? If I'm going to get 2 or 3 blocks of 10 megahertz, at the most 20 or 30, mm-hmm. and I'm going to add that to the existing portfolio of spectrum that I have, and I'm going to add that to existing towers and networks that I've already built, and I'm going to augment my existing coverage. There are a lot of other ways to achieve that. Number one, we're seeing now announcements by Verizon that, like Sprint, they're going to start doing 2 and 3 channel carrier aggregation to allow for capacity requirements and to give the customers the performance they need. And that's becoming a selling point. Now, one time we had only Sprint really going down this road, since they have some 80 megahertz of spectrum in 2.5. That's been their focus. In fact, it's Sprint that lacks the beachfront spectrum. Yeah. If you look around, AT&T's got it, Verizon certainly has it, and T-Mobile acquired it. And that's what's allowed T-Mobile to reach so-called parity in coverage and be able to compete effectively and satisfy the coverage requirements And they're also now beginning to offer these enhanced capacity packages.
Mm-hmm.
They're not necessarily doing it the same way. They're compressing.
Mm-hmm.
They're creating a way to access content that shrinks the amount of spectrum required. And it's working.
Yep.
So far, it's not only allowing them to satisfy the requirements of their existing customers, but they're able to attract customers. And in fact, they're gaining market share as a result. Sprint, on the other hand, which has been losing or flat at best, which has been competing not by coverage. They've got enough, let's say, basic coverage, but very thin coverage. And everything above that is in 2.5, and they have a lot of spectrum, but they've got to get it out to people. They've got to get it close enough to people. And they're not even in this auction.
Yeah.
So the guys who need the spectrum the most, in my opinion, are not participating. And you would think their parent company, who can afford to buy other kinds of assets, would consider whether they want to continue to invest in spectrum to enhance Sprint going forward. There's been almost no talk about Sprint's plans for 5G in millimeter wave, whereas there's a lot of talk on the part of Verizon about millimeter wave.
Mm-hmm.
There's been trials and activities on the part of AT&T regarding millimeter wave. So where does this demand come from? Where is the necessity to get 600 megahertz spectrum going to come from beyond the amount we think people are willing to pay based on the current number of 60-odd companies that are participating in the auction? So my guess is the way this has to be solved is to insert a kind of negotiation to reset the broadcaster's expectations. I think what happened was, in the first round, getting to the reverse auction, the FCC had to do all kinds of economic studies, and they had to be able to tempt broadcasters with a very high sense of value. And the higher that sense of value, the more willing they were to auction off more and more spectrum, including speculators. And that's what drove the expectations up to 86 billion. And I don't know that anyone really anticipated that getting that far out of hand.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to see how he adds this kind of negotiation stage before going into a second round of reverse auction. What's going to change in that round? Is we just going to reduce the amount of spectrum available? And why would that affect the value that the mobile operators assess for less spectrum? So you're going to only sell 80 megahertz. Well, then I'm only prepared to spend 40 billion.
Yeah.
So I don't get it. Somebody has to go in and change the seller's view so that it more closely matches what the buyers are willing to pay. And then we can see what the success and result will be. The longer it takes, by the way, the more complicated this is. Number one, we're going to see an election coming and a change of administration in the next 6 or 7 months.
Yep.
Which inevitably will lead to some changes at the FCC, if not beforehand. So this period, this remaining period of the Wheeler FCC, has got to be during which this gets done. Not just the auction itself, but the momentum behind the repacking, all the administrative processes to keep them. The last thing we need is to find out, we wake up at November 4th and find out that we have a different administration that doesn't even agree with this approach and rethinks the whole thing, sends it to square one. I don't know if that's possible. I don't know if it's likely, but if it's failed, that creates the uncertainty that somebody might end up stepping in and doing that.
No, that's a great point. I mean, I think you're right. I think we all kind of assumed that we would just move to the next stage of this auction and it would just kind of keep progressing. But like you said, you're right. I mean, less spectrum overall has less value. I mean, even like you said, if it's only 80 megahertz next time, well, there's not going to be as much of it's much of a pool coming in, so of money of bidders. So yeah, you're right. That's going to be an interesting dynamic. But what happens between stage one and stage two? You're right. There needs to be some sort of resetting, like you said, of what's going to happen out there. And that's going to be interesting to watch how that plays out. Because again, it is in the background, we've got this the election activity going on and various things, 5G momentum happening, and the FCC's Spectrum Frontiers initiative, which is the high band spectrum. And so a lot going on in the space right now. It's going to be interesting to see how the FCC manages all of that.
Yeah, and the FCC has initiated some other related activities that also have an impact on spectrum utilization, availability, and demand. So as an example, we're now testing the SAS systems, the systems that allow for spectrum sharing in the 3.5 band.
Yep.
And, we're becoming a bit more optimistic that, the initiative the FCC undertook and now the, let's say, implementation of that by the various parties who themselves are not really conducting an auction.
Mm-hmm.
They're not setting prices. They're testing a system. They're testing a method by which radar can share spectrum with commercial entities and allow for both to coexist and for there to be a demand from the part of commercial entities to utilize 3.5. If successful, that frees up a chunk of spectrum that could be utilized for fixed wireless,
mm-hmm.
right? Probably not a whole lot of mobility, but more of a fixed wireless network.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, you hear more and more that the first wave of 5G is going to be fixed wireless.
Yep.
Why do we need fixed wireless? When I'm sitting here on a Fios connection, I don't know what you're using, but I'm assuming it's a wired connection to a network. In fact, the instructions before this video conference were not to use any wireless connections because who knows what's going to happen. And on the other hand, there are a lot of people who are not within reach of the high capacity fiber network sufficient to be able to connect on a wire. And, Verizon and AT&T realize that connecting everybody over a fiber line directly to their home or some other technology that would be which would allow for high capacity links, whether it's, if it's not fiber, what is it? So, we've got cable operators who are looking at this. Mm-hmm. We have Verizon, AT&T certainly looking at this and saying, if we can do it in 3.5, if we can do it in 10 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz, 15 gigahertz bands, or 28 gigahertz band, which Verizon just bought from. So you start to think, well, if the time of availability for 600 megahertz is 2018-19, at that point, maybe we'll have moved on from this preoccupation of sub 1 gigahertz spectrum. Maybe we'll be thinking about spectrum in an entirely different way relative to how networks are built and architected and configured. Maybe we'll be thinking about millimeter wave spectrum as the fabric, and everything else is wired. Everything else is fiber.
Yeah, interesting.
Not to mention the fact that below 1 gigahertz, we have all these previous Gs, 2G, 3G, that today are the backup networks for the 4G networks. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the reality is our voice traffic is on 3G or 2G. So here we are in 2016. How much voice over LTE is there, right? What percentage of cellular voice traffic is over LTE as opposed to CS fallback?
Yeah.
It's certainly less than 10%.
Yeah.
Okay, it'll be growing. Okay, how fast will it be growing? How far will it reach by the time we start 5G? So there are a lot of questions and uncertainties, but no doubt we'll be refarming all those other spectrum bands at some point. And what's the trade-off between shutting down my 2G network or my 3G network, freeing up that spectrum versus buying this 600 megahertz spectrum? Somebody has to be looking at the economics again of that.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, again, obviously a lot to talk about, a lot to discuss in terms of the evolution of this auction and what's happening at Spectrum going forward. But Berge, we definitely appreciate the insight on this. Well, thanks for watching this week's show, and make sure to check us out again next week when we speak with Sprint on its latest 3-channel carrier aggregation trials in Chicago. Thanks for watching.